Good morning or good afternoon to all attendees, and welcome to the online training on mapping tourism value chains. This is the very first training that is organized online by the One Planet Sustainable Tourism Program, and we are very happy to welcome you all today. Um, I just wanted to, I hope everybody can listen and listen clearly. If you have any technical issues, you could use the chat to inform the either Svetlana or Maëlys, who are the organizers of the webinar. So thank you very much for being here. I'll just present quickly the Sustainable Tourism Program and the project in which this webinar is part of, and then we'll enter the topic of today. So Sustainable Tourism Program is actually network of over 160 organizations that are comprising governments, private company, NGOs, international organizations, as well as academia, and they all collaborate to advance sustainable consumption and production. And the One Planet Sustainable Tourism Program has an overall objective, which is to enhance sustainable development impacts of the tourism sector by 2030. Doing so by developing, promoting, and scaling up sustainable consumption and production practices to boost the efficient use of natural resources and to produce less waste, addressing the challenges of climate change and biodiversity as well. So this is summarized in the slide that you're seeing here. Allow me to introduce today the panelists of this training. So Mark is a partner at 3Kill, and Mark, would you like to introduce yourself briefly?
Good morning or afternoon, everyone. So I'm Mark Bartel. I'm a partner at 3Kill, which is a sustainability and resilience practice based in Oxford in the UK. And I've been working with colleagues in UN Environment and our in-country partners on the Transforming Tourism Value Chains project for almost 2 years now.
So Mark will be the main presenter today, and I will be accompanying him. So my name is Sandra Averus-Monry, and I'm a program officer at UN Environment, working on consumption and production, on value chains, and I am collaborating on this tourism program. So let me just go through a small introduction of the Transforming Tourism Value Chains project that that Mark just mentioned. It's a first training that we've developed for the One Planet Sustainable Tourism Program, and it's in the context of this specific project where we're working in developing countries and small island and development states to accelerate resource efficient and low carbon development. So this webinar is organized with UN Environment, with RAP, a technical partner in the project, and 3Kill. And thank you very much, Mark, for being here today. The project is funded by the German government, IKI, International Climate Change Initiative Program. So prior to go deeper into the objective of this online training, I would like just to provide you with a few technical instructions so that we have a smooth session today. So you will note that you are all in listen-only mode at the moment. Please make sure you're muted and that your web camera is off. You can ask questions to the panelists anytime during the whole webinar by posting your question in the chat box that you should see at the bottom of the webinar column. So please do use the chat box in this control panel to ask questions. There will be Q&A sessions actually after a couple of sessions, like clarification question, as well as towards the end of the webinar. So I will be reading out the questions and we'll do our best to answer them. And finally, the session is recorded and the YouTube link will be sent to you and posted in the One Planet Clearinghouse and the One Planet Sustainable Tourism Program webpage tomorrow. So thank you all again, and let's start. So this is an overview of the content of the training, and we will be, so just to so that we finish with the technical information, we'll be stopping after session 1 and 2 and pause for clarification questions through the chat box. Then after sessions 3, 4, and 5, so after session 5, then after session 7, and then we'll have hopefully some time for question and answer at the end of the webinar. What we're aiming at doing today is really to help you with a step-by-step methodology map tourism value chains. So mapping the value chain is one section and one objective. Identifying the actors is the follow-up session. Then we'll look into life cycle impacts, and we'll go back into these terms of value chain and life cycle pretty soon. Support the hotspots analysis to see what are the problems along this value chain. Identifying the existing initiatives, what you already have that addresses this problem, the shortlisting of solutions together with the relevant actors to be able to tackle these hotspots. And then we'll have a final 2 sessions to support from the business side, how do you develop a business case? And from a more policy perspective, how do you create a supportive policy framework? So the objective is to help you develop a value chain map, and that's addressing to private sector as well as governmental ministries, the public sector, but also research academia. And the objective is to make sure that in doing so, we identify and prioritize the life cycle environmental impact that are associated, understand how we can use and we can partner with the relevant stakeholders to address these issues, and together find a range of solutions so that we improve resource efficiency and reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the tourism sector. Finally, we'll look into the business case and policy framework. Just to let you know that we'll have this presentation today, but the set of slides will also be available. And in this set of slides, there will be additional notes or guidance below the slides, as well as some editable templates so that you can yourself map your value chain using the methodology. So as mentioned, I want to just come back to you as an introductory remark on the difference and why we're talking about value chains and why value chain is in the title of this training session. So you see like a full circle here on the left-hand side of the slide, and this full circle represents the value chain. For us, what is meant by supply chain is probably you're very familiar with that, is the process of making or selling goods, and it includes stages from the supply of material and the manufacture until distribution and sale. With a value chain, actually the end of life is also taken into perspective, and the value, meaning the environmental, economic, and social value, are also portrayed and showcased. So that's what we'll try to highlight when mapping a tourism value chain. So it's defined by ISO as the entire sequence of activities or parties that provide or receive value in the form of products or services. So you see the actors are very important, and they are both direct and indirect actors, and taking into account the full life cycle stages, including how the product or the service is dealt at end of life. With this, I'll hand over to Mark for the follow-up section that dives into mapping a value chain. So Mark, you should have the hand for continuing the session.
Thank you, Sandra. So the first section of the webinar then is looking at how to map the tourism value chain, and as Sandra said, it's perhaps a more all-encompassing view of activities within a particular sector than the conventional view of, say, a supply chain. And why we think this is a really important way of visualizing activity within the tourism value chain is that in taking a value chain perspective, you extend your kind of line of sight and influence beyond traditional areas of focus on immediate sort of tier one supply chain partners, and take a more comprehensive look at the commodity or the product or the service chain. And you're then able to create a map and structure that value chain, so you can see all of those organizations or companies that sit within it and how they interact with each other. So in taking that kind of perspective, you look both upstream to primary producers like farmers, growers, mining, minerals, the provision of fuels for energy, intermediate suppliers like food manufacturers or energy companies or water utility companies, and then right downstream to consumers, so to guests, to visitors, and to end-of-life management. And end-of-life management, just to be clear, is things like waste management or better resource management, or more advanced topics like the circular economy and tourism, how that could take place. And in doing this, we also try to consider indirect stakeholders. So when we're mapping the value chain, we try to identify also relevant government ministries or bodies, agencies, people that are involved in research and development or innovation in tourism, and financial or investment institutions as well. So the whole aim of this really is to kind of limit risk within the value chain by understanding it better and add value at each stage of the value chain, so that we can guide the activities that can be taken within the value chain. And that's kind of based on the identification of hotspots, threats, assets, opportunities, potential new partnerships or collaborations that can address the environmental impacts within the value chain. And as Sandra said, wherever possible, we try and work on the basis of a multifaceted value chain map. So we look at operational issues, we look at the economics of the value chain, the transaction values, we look at environmental and social information. And this we try and draw from a combination really of top-down national and tourism sector statistics and bottom-up primary data collection, which can be gathered by individual businesses or through value chain partners or by ministries or even those representing tourism destinations like trade bodies, as well as NGOs. So this is the sort of template that we have adopted to do this. And as you'll see, it's pretty well structured and it's a really good way of visualizing the value chain. And the UN Environment has taken this from some work from the International Trade Center and the WTO. And it's a really great way of seeing all of the activities within the value chain, being able to map those responsible for them, the transaction values, being able to locate environmental impact hotspots within the map. And you have at the end of this, as you'll see as we go through the different sections, we can create something that's very visual, very compelling, very easy to process. So just to go through this very quickly, on the left-hand side of the slide there, you'll see all of the activity within the tourism value chain that relates to, if you like, the activities before you actually get into a given destination. Whereas the middle block there at the top, you can see we talk about how do the different ministries within a country interact with tourism. So you could have a Ministry of Tourism, but equally ministries of trade, commerce, infrastructure, environment, those relating to climate change or culture, all have a part to play in the tourism value chain. And then we have trade and promotional organizations. And then below that, some of the kind of environmental issues that we try and understand better using a value chain mapping approach. So things like the use of energy, water stewardship, maintenance and protection of the natural environment, and so on, and the sourcing of ingredients for things like food and beverage products. And then below that, there's the kind of the upstream value chain, so food and drink, manufacturing, storage, distribution, logistics, as well as looking after the sort of physical infrastructure within a tourism destination, like site signage, roads, logistics, hotels, restaurants, and so on. And then below that, you'll see at the bottom there, in the grey boxes, we look at the different facets of in-destination activity, like transportation, accommodation, provision of food and beverage, any creative industries like handicrafts or music and dance or other cultural assets. And then we try and identify tourism assets as well, because they're obviously key to any tourism destination. They're part of the value, part of the attraction of that destination. So in understanding better where those tourism assets are, we can actually understand how to maximize the value of them, how to protect them, and how to promote them. And those assets can be cultural, so archaeology or music, museums, festivals. They can be natural, lakes, rivers, reefs, mountains, beaches, or they can be built assets, so infrastructure, architecture, utilities, and so on. And then right the way through to tourism services like leisure facilities, tours, excursions, attractions, and then support services. So hopefully you'll see this is a pretty all-encompassing way of looking at the tourism value chain. It's incredibly visual and very helpful. And then finally on the right-hand side there, you see in the yellow, sort of yellowy orange boxes, are the sort of environmental impacts or impact categories as they're sometimes described, that we are seeking to better understand within the tourism value chain. So it's things like greenhouse gas emissions, wastage, resource efficiency, and so on. And it's important to understand that when we look at these different environmental impacts, that we try and adopt a life cycle approach to this. So we look at the different stages of the value chain, so from raw material extraction right the way through to waste and end of life. And I'll go into that in a bit more detail very shortly. So hopefully this gives you a really good kind of visual setup, a good template to start mapping the tourism value chain. One of the first steps then in having seen that template is to actually understand what the goal and scope of your tourism value chain map is. It's really important to do this, to think very carefully about what your objectives are, what you're trying to achieve with the value chain map, because that then in turn determines the sort of depth, breadth, and types of data and information you require to produce your value chain map. And there are obviously a number of different ways in which you can use it. So as a policymaker in a national ministry, you might want to get a better understanding of the entire tourism value chain across the whole country at a national level, or if you're a relevant sort of value chain actors, looking at expenditure patterns, environmental impacts at the destination level as well. Whereas as a tourism business, you might want to map and visualize your value chain partners, better understand your environmental impacts, use your relationships with your supply chain partners or your value chain partners, or your ability to influence the way guests consume resources to drive positive change. So it's all about sort of finding the different levers, the different methods of addressing these key environmental hotspots. So I mentioned, and Sandra mentioned this earlier, when we do value chain mapping, we try and take this life cycle view. So you'll see from the diagram that goes from left to right here, it is literally from the extraction of raw materials and resources, or any form of resource need you might need in a tourism value chain, to any manufacturing and production, And that also includes, by the way, service provision. So it might not necessarily be a physical product. Then to distribution and sales of products and services, their use and consumption within the tourism sector, and their disposal, recycling, or reuse at the end of life. So it's this kind of whole life view of the tourism value chain really helps to add value to the mapping process. It helps you to kind of think of all of the activities taking place in your value chain, where your raw materials are coming from, how your food and beverage products are sourced and provided to you, how the business operates and is maintained. And it can also help you to think about how to become more resource efficient, more resilient, and reduce the amount of waste or greenhouse gas emissions within the sector. Now, obviously, there's quite a lot of information to gather. This will also depend on the scope of the value chain map. But you can see here from this particular slide, there are a number of kind of common data sources. And I've tried to break this down into three distinct kind of buckets, if you like, of data that you could obtain from any of these sources. So on the value chain side of things, it may be that you can go to the websites or visit the Ministries of Tourism and Trade. You could look at what resources and materials available through the World Tourism Organization or the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, if you're particularly looking at food. And there are a whole range of other national sources there for data, like national statistics bureaus, national accounts, tourism satellite accounts would be another one. So there's lots of different ways in which you can gather data to build your value chain map. I am also aware that there are a number of acronyms here, and these are described in the notes below this slide. So things like quality management system and environmental management system, so QMS and EMS. So this is just a structured way in which tourism businesses may be managing their operations and their performance. Next, we have economic data sources. So some of the same sources of information, but maybe including also things like customs agencies and port authorities. And then on the right-hand side, environmental data sources. So this could be information provided by the Ministry of Environment or through regulatory bodies and agencies, through the billing or information you may receive from energy and water companies or waste management companies. Some countries also have national green accounts, which help you to understand the environmental impacts from different sectors of the economy. And then sort of drilling down into higher resolution detail, there's an awful lot of information that can be gathered from within tourism businesses and value chains as well. So I'm going to move swiftly on. Other potential data sources could be conference papers and proceedings, specialist databases, academic and market research studies, or even media reports. Often we find media reports actually highlight emerging issues within the tourism value chain, so it can be very useful. So that's really kind of looking at all the sources of secondary data and information at different scales that might be helpful to build your value chain map. There is also the opportunity to use a range of different approaches to collect primary data, either within a destination or within an individual tourism business or perhaps a tourism value chain itself. And this is just a very, very effective way of doing it. And we describe this as walking the chain. So later on, when we talk a bit about how you identify those value chain partners, basically this is about walking the chain with your value chain partners and identifying it and prioritizing any problems you might experience, like things like food waste or inefficient use of energy, or a particular waste infrastructure issue that might be affecting the quality of the tourism asset. But basically, this is a very straightforward process where you engage value chain partners, you undertake a mapping exercise as per the graphic here, and you're looking at things like the physical flow of products and materials or the provision of services, the financial flows within a value chain, any information processing points that could provide you with data and information on the value chain, and the flow of information within a value chain, and how that may be improved to improve the performance of the value chain. And then finally, any kind of environmental impact hotspots that might arise from anything that you see as you walk the chain. So you go through an engagement process, this sort of mapping exercise. So this is literally mapping with a whole load of post-it notes on a wall, all the things you can see as you walk through the chain with your value chain partners. You can do things like hotspots analysis, which I'll talk a bit about in a moment, identify solutions using workshops, shortlist those solutions, and then look at business cases and work plans. So this is a kind of end-to-end process for data collection and identifying solutions. So scoping your map, as we said earlier, it's really important to actually understand what it is you want to achieve. So within this map, you'll see the dotted lines indicate the chosen scope of the value chain activity. So this is looking at the scope of the map is then limited to in-destination accommodation, food supply, environmental impacts that are linked to it are highlighted in red on the right-hand side, and all life cycle stages are going to be considered within this particular scope for this example. So it's just a way of visually picking out which parts of the tourism value chain you're the most interested in understanding more about. And then using those data sets that we've looked at, and this is a real life example from the Dominican Republic, where we've used a combination of things like national accounts and tourism satellite accounts and direct engagement with tourism businesses to really understand where the value is in terms of the transactions, the interactions between different value chain partners. So you can see here, for example, that food and drink suppliers in the middle of the diagram, that represents $306 million of procurement activity within the tourism value chain in the Dominican Republic. So this kind of helps us to understand where some of the levers might be if you're trying to improve environmental performance. When you see significant value chain relationships like this and the value assigned to them, it helps you to kind of hone in on those value chain partners you would possibly need to pay most attention to in responding and addressing these environmental impacts. Okay, I'm going to move on now to the next section. Actually, I won't, because I think we're going to take a break for questions.
Yes, thank you, Mark. We received a couple of questions. I think one very specific on the slide on mapping the value chain. The person asking the question is saying, I don't see air transport, which is a tourism industry, under the transportation column. Why? And maybe if you're comfortable, Mark, to answer, otherwise I can take that one. And the other question is, what is the link between sustainability and value chain with respect to the tourism industry? So a much broader question. Yeah, answer what you want, and if I need, I can complement.
Okay, thank you. So you're right, definitely air travel should be in there, and I think it is in some of the later slides, so apologies for that. It's definitely an issue for us. I think the reason it's not in this particular value chain map is that within the Transforming Tourism Value Chains project, that was air transport was largely out of scope. We were focusing much more on the in-destination activities, but we obviously recognize that air transport is a significant issue and concern within the tourism sector, particularly in terms of climate change. On the value chain mapping and the link to sustainable tourism, as you'll see as we go through this slide deck, creating something that's very visual and that allows you to understand the relationships within a value chain allows us to then identify and interrogate, if you like, what the environmental impacts of some of those relations or arising from some of those relationships or activities within the value chain map are. So I won't answer that question any more fully, because I think you'll see it's answered over the course of the next few questions of the presentation.
Thank you very much. I'm not seeing any. Oh, yeah, there is another question that just arrived. So it's asking, do we have the tool to share the calculations for secondary and primary data sources to the transaction value? Can be challenging with data variation accuracy from different sources. Mark, would you like to share the experience of the Dominican Republic in this regard?
Yeah, so what we did, just taking the Dominican Republic as an example, we worked directly with the ministries. The Dominican Republic does have a very detailed set of satellite accounts, which gives us much more granular data around how money is spent and by whom, with whom within the value chain. We appreciate that not all tourism destinations have that level of granularity. But we drew on all sorts of different data sources, from the tourism satellite accounts to national accounts provided by the Ministries of Trade and Commerce. The tourism ministry had also done some analysis a year or so ago on the value chain there, which we were able to draw upon. And then we talked directly, so we surveyed quite a lot of hotels within the destinations, within the 3 destinations we were focusing on within the Dominican Republic. And we actually asked them if they could provide us with procurement information. That is, can be quite a complex thing to do, particularly when you have an international hotel chain where the procurement activity may be taking place outside of the tourism destination. So it's about really allowing enough time for the in-destination hotels within a value chain to speak to the central procurement teams at their head offices, wherever they may be. And a bit of work is required to interrogate that procurement information. So I guess what I'm saying is it's a combination of nationally available data and new primary data that's sourced directly from tourism businesses or value chains within a destination or a country.
Thank
Hopefully
you. And yeah, I think it does. And probably just to respond, there is not specific tool to share calculation. It's really when looking at the map and doing a background research of where is the economic value in the tourism sector, trying to link both the visualization with the data that you have, so that you can see, as in the slide that Mark was showing, visually, okay, this is a very important area, and we just need to get that into account when we look at the environmental impact. Maybe we should stop questions here so that we don't run too late. I think a couple of other questions came in, but maybe we can park them towards the end if they are still relevant, and we can just advance on the sessions. Apologies for the couple of questions that just arrived, but just to keep track of the time.
Okay, so Sandra, what we can do is, if we collate all the questions that haven't been answered, then I will be happy to do that, to provide answers to them that you can then circulate to everyone participating.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'll move on then. So the next section then is about understanding more about how to identify value chain actors and influencers, and looking at some of those assets and potential risks within the tourism value chain. So this is just a kind of a pictorial representation of the number of layers that we look at when we try to identify tourism stakeholders, assets, and any risks. So we start with, as you will have seen from the earlier graphic of the template for the value chain map, we start with any international or regional organizations. We look at the ministries involved. We also look at banks, investors, donors, and shareholders, because they could be potential leverage points for action or enablers in terms of inward investment for new infrastructure or improvements in sustainability performance within the sector. We work with supporting government ministries and agencies, and in some cases local government departments, where some of the legislative or regulatory powers are devolved to local government. Sometimes we have to work with local government in a particular tourism destination to actually understand a bit more about how the government infrastructure works within a destination. We look at the infrastructure support for tourism, so utilities like energy and water, transportation and logistics, information and communication technology, maintenance, and so on and so forth. And taking that whole value chain life cycle approach, we look right the way upstream to primary producers like farmers, growers, fishermen, timber providers, fuel and mining companies, and so on, and through to product manufacturers, which can also be service providers, then wholesalers and retailers, end consumers, and then that whole waste management end of life approach. So in doing that, we're identifying where the raw materials are coming from that supply the sector, where the resources are coming from, and also identifying where the key assets are. So these are the green boxes here. So we may have, for example, a tourism attraction that is an ancient intact forest. Clearly, we would like to protect that to maintain the quality of the tourism environment. Or we may be extracting groundwater for drinking water supply from a local aquifer, and we need to make sure that we are looking after that, the quality of that drinking water resource. We may have a national park that is designated as protected, and need to make sure that that is suitably compliant. And we may be relying on pristine beaches and reefs and islands and so on. And so the red boxes then are some of the risks that we might start to identify as we look at the value chain in more detail. So, for example, in agriculture, we might be concerned about high greenhouse gas emissions. We might be concerned about high energy costs throughout the value chain and the impact that has on the economy of the tourism sector. We might, when we get towards the consumption phase, we might be concerned about the impact of road congestion on tourism experience and whether that's a risk or not. And then we might have some concerns also around how we are, quote unquote, consuming a tourism asset and whether that is leading to any habitat degradation. So this is just a really simple way of structuring how to identify some of those stakeholders using a kind of layered approach and that whole value chain, whole life cycle approach. So once we've done that, and this again is from the Dominican Republic, we found it's really useful that having identified a range of stakeholders that we might want to engage with as part of improving the performance of the tourism value chain, it's sometimes good to map those stakeholders so that you can identify the ones that you really want to, you consider to be a key actor in the tourism sector and that you want to manage and engage with closely. So in the case of this diagram, you can see in the top right hand of the grid, there's just some examples there. So the Ministry of Environment is considered to be a key one in the Dominican Republic. They also have a resource efficiency and cleaner production center, which can help with things like energy efficiency, renewable energy, resource efficiency in tourism. So these are the sort of actors that we can call upon to improve the sustainability performance of the tourism value chain. So this is a nice way of getting down to a manageable number of actors to engage with, simply by understanding their kind of level of expertise and engagement and their willingness to engage as well, their interest in the topic. So hopefully that gives you a reasonable appreciation of just some of the ways in which we can understand specific actors and prioritize them within the value chain. I'm now going to move on and just talk a bit about looking at life cycle impacts and how to assign them to different parts of the value chain. I'm going to try and keep this as jargon-free as I possibly can, so bear with me. So you've already seen a bit of this diagram already. So we've talked about this, the life cycle being from raw material extraction or ingredient sourcing through manufacturing, distribution and sales, use and consumption, and disposal or recycling or reuse. And what we're trying to understand now is a bit more about the granularity of that information. So in our raw material needs or natural resource needs for the tourism sector, what are the sorts of things we might be talking about? And you can see in the table below that the raw materials we might be looking at are agricultural crops, the provision of land, water resources, minerals, and so on. And the final row at the bottom of the table there just gives an indication of some of the environmental impacts we might also be looking at as a result of using those raw materials. So things like greenhouse gas emissions, potential for food waste, the need to treat wastewater, and then all the way through. So I'm not going to necessarily read out all of these examples, but this just gives you maybe an idea of how we start to break out the different parts of the value chain and the different parts of the product or service life cycle in a way that makes these environmental impacts and activities that are associated with them more transparent. So there's another kind of dimension to this as well. So looking at the impact side of things, so raw materials could include the kind of impacts could include land use, the impacts on land use and land use change. It could be denuding wild caught fish stocks. It might be about energy use and management in manufacturing, and all of these sorts of things. So the table at the bottom of the slide really just provides you with some example impacts for each stage of the tourism value chain, and starting to assign some sense of the likely, forgive the term, severity of the impact. So whether it's a high, you consider it to be qualitatively speaking, a high, medium, or low concern as an impact. So in this case, some of the examples from land use might be that the tourism value chain might be experiencing some biodiversity loss as a result of land use change. So thinking through how to better protect that biodiversity resource to maintain the quality of the tourism experience, and that could be a combination of policy, regulation, or individual tourism businesses activities. Looking at things like the volume of energy you're using, whether you can be more energy efficient as a tourism business, or maybe the potential to use in situ renewable energy to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from energy use. Again, I won't go through all of these examples because we don't really have the time, but this is just to give you some examples of how to structure some of the life cycle thinking around the value chain map. So having done that, I think the chances are that you will find that there are quite a few quite a good long list of potential environmental impacts associated with tourism sector activities and processes, and those particularly in the value chain that might be, if you like, hidden from sight in the destination. And one of the techniques we have used within the Transforming Tourism project is a technique called hotspots analysis. And hotspots analysis is really about trying to prioritize your environmental impacts and understand what actions you need to take to address them. So two key stages within hotspots analysis. So for this, we have used a methodology that the UN Environment Lifecycle Initiative has produced. I was lucky enough to co-chair this work over a couple of years to develop this methodology. But essentially, you'll see here, in a very similar way, it's a very kind of process-driven approach. So very similar to the sort of things we've been talking about in value chain mapping. So defining goal and scope, gathering data, seeking expert insight, identifying and validating hotspots with key tourism stakeholders, looking to identify and prioritizing actions, identifying any implementation gaps. So that you may find some existing initiatives or activities, but there may be gaps in addressing hotspots. Reviewing and validating those initial findings again with key stakeholders and experts. presenting and communicating those findings to a wider audience within tourism, and then reviewing and revisiting those hotspots and the hotspots analysis. As you feel you may have addressed some of those hotspots adequately, you might want to move on to the next highest ranking hotspots within your list. So this is an 8-step methodological framework. The direct link to that guidance is at the bottom of the slide there if you want to take a closer look at it. But essentially what we mean, how we define a hotspot, is an environmental impact that contributes to more than 50% of the life cycle impact across all of a product or surface life cycle stages. So it has to be quite a significant activity or impact for it to be counted as a hotspot. And it can take place in any, I'm going to use this horrible term, impact category. So it could be a hotspot that relates to greenhouse gas emissions. It could be for energy use, it could be for water use, or it could be for waste. And that's just the way we kind of categorize and classify different environmental impacts when we look at hotspots analysis. So a very simple way of doing that is to use an incredibly simple matrix, and you can use this at all sorts of different levels, by the way. I'm going to show you some examples in a minute that are at the product level, but you could use them, for example, to look at the hotspots relating to energy use or relating to built infrastructure within a tourism destination. And it's, again, here just a very simple way looking at that product life cycle down the left-hand side, so from raw materials to disposal or reuse, and then across the top looking at the different types of hotspot you might have around waste or greenhouse gas emissions. We also have a category there that looks at other types of impact, so that could be biodiversity, for example. So just to give you an idea of how we might complete this, so it's at the first step, so having looked at those life cycle stages and the impacts associated with them in the tourism value chain and gone through that exercise, we go through this exercise now of actually looking at where the key hotspots might be. So taking that 50% kind of large, something you consider qualitatively to be a significant issue, we would complete this matrix. So we would complete the matrix as a red cell, where it contributes to 50% of the total life cycle impact across all life cycle stages. We might want to consider secondary hotspots, so something that we feel is of a lower scale of impact, but still worth capturing. So maybe 25 to 50% of total life cycle impacts across all life cycle stages. And we might also want to pat ourselves on the back because we feel that maybe an existing initiative has actually already addressed a hotspot. So we'll mark that in green. So let me show you what that looks like just for an individual product. So we often find within tourism that food and beverages is a significant issue, particularly around the sourcing of things like beef, and the food waste may be associated with it. So what we see here, just as an example, is if we go right back to agriculture, we see there are issues here around greenhouse gas emissions from burping cows, greenhouse gas emissions as a result of manure management in livestock management. We might look at in manufacturing where you've got abattoir waste, you've not got good carcass utilization for cuts of meat to be used in tourism. Or indeed, you might experience meat waste in hotels and restaurants, possibly mainly from plate waste. So you see here, we've categorized the key hotspots as we see them for this product in red, the secondary hotspots in that kind of ambery orange color, and we've identified a particular solution that's been deployed already, which is a vacuum packing system which maintains the shelf life of beef for far longer than would otherwise be the case, thus reducing food waste. And then we would typically at the bottom look at the key variables that would affect the environmental impacts for a given product. So it could be the production system, for example, whether beef is grass-fed or corn-fed. It could be whether the beef is being sourced from a dairy beef herd, so it's serving a dual purpose, or it could be the age of cattle at slaughter. So all of these variables have a bearing on the hotspots associated with beef. This is just, and I'm not going to go into detail on this, but this is just another example looking at beer, which is obviously a key part of tourism in most destinations. So you can kind of see the sort of things that you would identify relating to the supply of beer into tourism. One thing just to note here, when you start looking at things like this, we were quite surprised when we went back and had a look at water use to create 1 litre of beer or 1 pint of beer. You're actually using 120 times more water than a litre to create a litre of beer, because you're looking at right the way back into agriculture, irrigation water, processing water, bottle cleaning, washing within the hotel or restaurant. So when you take this whole life cycle view, you often uncover environmental impacts that you might not uncover in any other way. So having gone through this, it's always good to get some structure around this and to try and rank and summarize those hotspots in a way that you can present to other tourism value chain stakeholders. So the first thing we tend to do is create tables like this, which you can organize your environmental impacts by. So in this case, we've looked at greenhouse gas emissions at the top there, energy, water, and waste. We've clearly described each hotspot in terms of its location, its magnitude. We've been able to cite references from research, and we've also been able to show that some of that research has been done locally versus some secondary data that we've used to help us better understand the hotspot. We've then gone about using these red circles, ranking the hotspots by significance for each category of environmental impact. So what is the highest greenhouse gas impact? In this case, it is beef and dairy products, as we've just discussed. But we might also want to look at the impact of food waste in hotels and restaurants, for example, as a key waste hotspot. So this is a really good way of structuring what you've found as you've gone through this process and summarizing it and ranking it with these numerical identifiers so that you can start to map these hotspots into a value chain map. And this slide here shows exactly how we've done that. So we have mapped the hotspots in the locations in the value chain, and we have described them in brief at the bottom. So this is a very powerful way of looking at how we can visualize the hotspots in a value chain map. And you'll see here also in purple writing, we've identified in some of these hotspot locations the key value chain actors we need to work with. So whether it be an energy company or a waste management company or a food wholesaler, we have that information there. We understand that this is an important area to address, and we know who we can approach to help us address that particular hotspot. And then just trying to finalize this, sometimes it's quite useful to create something like this. So this is a piece of work we did within the Transforming Tourism project, which helped us to visualize where and provide context to these hotspots in a value chain context. So going right back to the mining and fossil fuels, the provision of renewable energy. So it's a really good pictorial way of describing where the issues are in the value chain, where the hotspots are, so that you can communicate them. So you'll see at the bottom here, it's quite small font size, but you might be able to see this on your screen. This is the data extracted from that ranking table I just shared with you, and just put into summary form in this sort of infographic approach. So I'm just going to take a short breath. So just very quickly then, one of the things that is, do you want to take questions?
Yeah, maybe we have a number of questions,
okay.
if it's okay with
sure.
you.
That's fine, go on.
Okay, thank you very much. And I guess that was the most dense part of the
I hope so.
of the training. They are very specific questions to specific slides. So I'll probably just shot the questions directly, and then there are more like context one.
Sure.
There are two questions referring to the stakeholders map.
Yes.
One is how to interpret stakeholders' relationship, direct and indirect, in the mapping.
Yeah.
And the second one is what is the meaning of the big and small circles? So in the stakeholder mapping as well, it's like it's
Yes, I get what you mean.
3.2.
Yeah.
Yeah. Does it mean the great or lesser impact? So these are the two specific questions on stakeholder map,
Okay,
if you want to
so
answer.
I will try my best. So direct stakeholders would be those you are directly engaging with. So if you're a tourism business, you're a hotel chain, or you're a restaurant chain, then this would most likely be your tier one suppliers for all of your products and services. So that will be a direct tourism stakeholder. An indirect tourism stakeholder in that context would be your tier two or tier three suppliers, or even your primary producers, if you don't have a direct commercial relationship with them and you're relying on a wholesaler or a supplier to provide you with food and beverage products, for example. It could also be that an indirect stakeholder might be a government ministry or agency, so a key influencer, but someone you might not necessarily have day-to-day contact with, but that nonetheless could be really useful to engage with when you're looking at how to address some of these hotspots with partners. And in terms of
Yeah,
the circle,
yeah.
the larger the circle, the higher the likely interest, expertise, or experience of those stakeholders. I hope that
Thank you.
those make sense.
Yeah, and on stakeholders, it's likely that direct stakeholders are also your staff or your
Yes.
the tourists that are in your facilities, or eventually as well the person that come day to day to gather the garbages or the waste, for example. While
Yes.
the waste infrastructure, government or local government could be an indirect one, but a very important one as well.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So it's anyone really you have a direct engagement with.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And then another very specific question on 4.2, so assessing life cycle impacts. There is a mention on including the likely severity of impact, high, medium, and low. And the question is, how is that determined?
So in some cases, you will have identified something that is really significant already, and that it chimes with you. So, for example, you might look at the energy you're using with heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems within a hotel. And typically, we have found from this work that that can contribute anywhere between 35 and 50% of total hotel energy use. And so you might not have the precise numbers or percentages, but you can see from metering or from billing from utilities that this is a significant issue, and therefore you should characterize it as a high impact activity, and that it is something that you should be looking to solutions for. Does that make sense?
To me, yes.
Great. Okay.
Um, then we have a number of questions that are specific on more on the hotspots analysis and the example of beef or beer. One is, would you consider only locally produced goods or also imported goods, considering the impact of transport in greenhouse gas emission?
Yes, so in that case, we would probably consider both, but likely at the stage we're looking at hotspots, we would have a pretty good understanding of the proportion of food and beverage coming from domestic suppliers versus overseas or international suppliers. So that helps us to focus our efforts on where we should be paying the most attention. So I know with the Dominican Republic, a very high proportion of their food and beverage products are imported. And obviously that importation process brings with it not just environmental impacts, but higher costs. So there are two levers here that in that situation that we were able to engage with. There was, how do we increase the potential for more localized supply? How do we improve the efficiency of the importation process? So rather than air freighting, could it be sea freight? Or how do we address issues around resource inefficient use, or use the value of those imported goods and the importance of that relationship as an influencing lever with the supply chain, with the value chain.
Mark is already hinting into the solutions.
I am sorry about that.
No worries. And there are a good number of questions, so let me try to scroll a little. There is also a question on whether it's possible to assess the impact of how is it possible to assess the impact of tourism activities on wastewater, and what type of activities are impacting wastewater. And let me give you another question, which is how in slide 5.1 on the meat waste, how do you come up with a percentage value for a cell in the metrics? Meaning, how do you quantify total life cycle impact? Yeah.
So let's just go with the meat waste first. So what we have tended to do is work directly with hotels and restaurants, and we do things like kitchen audits or restaurant audits. And that really helps us to understand the amount of meat wasted in inventory, so that maybe goes out of date, out of use by date, it's not food safe anymore, versus meat waste during the preparation of a meal or the cooking of a meal, versus meat waste that is related to guests or visitors' plate waste. And that allows us, being able to have that sense of the drivers behind meat waste, also allows us to identify potential solutions. So could you repeat the first question, Sandra?
Yes, sure. The first question was, how can you assess the impact of tourism activities on wastewater?
Oh, yes. Yeah. So it really will depend on the destination and the infrastructure in the destination. If you have a well-formed destination with good water treatment, it's probably quite unlikely that tourism would have a major effect on wastewater and water quality. If you don't, then it can be a whole different story, and you may find yourself needing to spend time and money on providing in situ treatment. And we know this happens already in a number of tourism destinations where the national infrastructure is simply not there in some geographies. And so the tourism sector works together to develop water treatment. But we have seen in our work some instances where an inadequate water treatment and water supply infrastructure has led to situations where destinations have been temporarily closed. So we've seen examples of where wastewater treatment has not been adequate, and you've had a coliform release, and that's led to a high rate of infections in guests. And the only way you can get around that is to close the destination until you've put wastewater treatment facilities in place to avoid ill health amongst guests. You can imagine that that's not the ideal tourism experience for these guests. That it's also in doing that, it's important to engage with national and local government and your water utilities providers to help you to understand what the current state of infrastructure is and its ability to treat wastewater.
Yeah, and maybe it links to another question that we had more like generic on the fact that there are not so many infrastructure for waste in some destinations, and what can be done beyond a long-term investment on waste infrastructure. And it's very likely that there are also activities and action that can be done by the tourism actors that are preventive. So if we take the example of plastics, for example, if there is no proper way to treat plastic waste in a destination, and especially in an island, some preventive measures such as changing for reusable items rather than single use can be done. So it's just to highlight that there are immediate or medium term solutions that can be taken by the different type of actors. So trying to respond to one of these questions as well. Yeah.
Yeah, so certainly at some destinations we have seen hotels sink their own wells to provide drinking water supply to guests. We've also seen them install water treatment plants on site, and in some cases we've seen different hotels or whole resorts co-invest in things like composting or anaerobic digestion plants to manage food waste. And obviously with anaerobic digestion is a process of treating organic waste in the absence of air, and that generates a biogas that's part methane, which can then be used as a renewable energy source. The heat from anaerobic digestion can also be used to heat hotels where it's required, and the resultant solid digestate can be used as a compost in hotel grounds and gardens.
There are a good number of questions still, but we definitely need to move on. Maybe one last question, which is also helps clarifying what we mean by hotspots. A question is, are the hotspots based on input ingredients or tourism business activity? For example, housekeeping does not have many external inputs that you have in the kitchen, but nevertheless adds value to the tourism product and has big environmental impact. So the examples here are food related, but hotspots could be also devices and could be services or activities indeed.
Yeah, so apologies for giving food examples only. There are obviously hotspots that are associated with things like, as I've already mentioned, heating, ventilation, air conditioning, with room or public space lighting. So that's energy and greenhouse gas emissions. So all of these could be characterized as potential hotspots. And indeed services, it's not so much the way in which the service is directly applied, like housekeeping, but it can be relating to the products that housekeeping teams use. So for example, some household cleaning products are much more environmentally sustainable and responsible than others. Household cleaning products can also operate in reuse systems, so refillable cleaning liquid containers versus single-use trigger sprays. There are so many different ways in which you can do that. Laundering, use of energy efficient equipment in housekeeping, so vacuum cleaners, that sort of thing, also contribute to a reduction in the hotspots associated with that sort of service.
Thank you very much, Mark. And I think we can move on and we'll try to be brief so that we park a couple of questions for the end as well. So
sure.
Please.
Okay. So moving on. So identifying existing initiatives. So having gone through this whole process of building the value chain map, understanding where the key stakeholders are, the level of influence you may have in partnering with them or working with them, the potential for collaborations and so on. Obviously, one thing you don't want to do is duplicate effort. So one important step in this is actually identifying whether there are any existing initiatives that could help you to address a hotspot, or indeed may already be addressing a hotspot. So it's important to really understand this. So just to get a sense of what is already happening. And again, you can see here that this is potentially an investigation on a number of different levels. So right from the very top, from international, are there any national commitments that affect the tourism sector in a country, for example, relating to the UN Paris Agreement on climate change? Or are there any sustainability initiatives within the World Tourism Organization or the World Travel and Tourism Council that you might want to take account of? Or what are the requirements of green tourism certification schemes that need to be met? So that's kind of the international side of things. There may be at the national level key sustainable tourism strategies or plans or targets. There might be other strategies or targets relating to issues that affect tourism, so renewable energy targets, energy efficiency targets, biodiversity action plans, water quality standards, and so on. And then at the sectoral level, there may well be collaborations already around, green transport planning or water stewardship initiatives, or the sharing of best practice guidance between across the sector, or even pre-competitive collaborations. So in some countries, we've seen voluntary agreements arise as a result of identifying hotspots within tourism. And that's where everyone comes together in a public-private sector voluntary agreement to deliver improvement targets across the sector. And then in the destination itself, you might see those green transport plans, you might see beach, reef or river monitoring activities, waste management and recycling infrastructure, water abstraction and monitoring and so on, or even simple things like sharing laundry facilities, which can then improve your the energy and water use hotspots relating to hotel laundry activity. And then finally, within the business value chain itself, individual businesses may have climate change targets or initiatives. They may be committed to building or room energy management systems. They might be installing renewable energy. They might have their own water treatment plants. They might be measuring their food waste already, or they might be engaging with guests and doing awareness raising with guests and visitors. Or they may, as Sandra said, they may have single-use plastics bans, so no plastic straws, no plastic cups, moving to reusable glass cups, not using small shampoo or shower gel containers, but refillable receptacles on the bathroom wall in the hotel room. There's all manner of things that you can find from doing a search at these different levels. But the key thing is to really understand what is going on already, how those existing initiatives and activities relate to the hotspots you've identified, and critically, whether there are any gaps in those existing initiatives that need to be filled to address the hotspots and to help you collaborate with your value chain partners. Finally, then, just moving into kind of the solution side of things. So having identified those existing initiatives and potential solutions, it's also worth then looking at how you identify and shortlist solutions. So we do this in two ways, really. One which focuses on business actors, and one which focuses on the kind of national level interventions or solutions you might find. And we tend to use these very simple idea generation templates. So what we would do here, typically in a workshop sort of activity or within different teams within a business, we would look at what the business solutions might be. They could be new products, new ways of delivering a service, a different business model, for example. And we try and capture as many ideas as we can in the left-hand column. And we normally do this in about 45 minutes to an hour. And we find that we can create anything up to 20 ideas in that space of time. It's quite creative, quite innovative. So we capture all of those ideas in a long list to start with. And then we use the filters to the right of that column, like how much might it cost to implement? Is it more expensive, less expensive? What the sustainability benefit might be, what the customer or consumer benefit or guest benefit might be, what the business benefit might be. Is there any kind of issue around technical or commercial feasibility with the solution? How difficult is it to implement? is it a priority, and what sort of time frame could you deliver that solution within? And particularly those last two columns, priority and time frame, it's important to spend a bit of time on that, because if you've understood what the priority is for that solution, you've already helped to rank that long list and produce a short list of maybe 2 or 3 solutions you want to explore in more detail. But also, if you've identified the time frame, you can start to create a roadmap for those solutions to basically help you to collaborate with your value chain and reduce those hotspots. One thing I should say is that we have, in all workshops that we've run in the project, made sure that when we run these workshops, we operate both the business idea generation workshop and the national level policy workshops at the same time, because it's important to understand how the business and policy solutions are considered together. So, for example, you might identify a policy option which might be improve energy efficiency performance standards, and that could be used to help drive a business action with a hotel chain or a whole destination for that matter. For national level solutions, we tend to talk about what are the ideas we can generate around policy development, strategy, legal or regulatory frameworks, but there are other policy instruments that we can use as well, and I'm not going to dwell too much on that because Sandra's going to cover that in more detail in a second. The filters here are slightly different in that we are talking here more about things like societal benefit and the fact that or whether or not a particular policy strategy or some form of other policy instrument supports business action. So slightly different filters, but also trying to get to that sense of what is the level of priority here and what is the time frame that solution can be delivered within. So these are the basic templates we use. They're incredibly easy to use. We've used them with pretty much every tourism stakeholder you can imagine. And they are very effective at helping people to generate ideas and then prioritize them. So it's largely qualitative, and obviously having done this and you've shortlisted your solutions, the chances are you will need to go back if you're a tourism business and talk to colleagues about how you might implement that and gather more information on that solution to test its feasibility some more. But as a workshopping activity, it's a really great way of generating ideas for solutions. And so what might you do with that in terms of road mapping? So we tend to think of roadmaps as short, medium, and long-term solutions or innovations. And in our workshopping activity within the project, we tend to think of short-term as 1 to 3 years, medium-term 4 to 6 years, and longer-term anything up to 10 years. So longer-term could be an improvement in national wastewater infrastructure, for example, which we know would take quite a lot of time to implement. Short-term might be remove all single-use plastic within a year and substitute it with reuse or recycling systems. The key thing about this diagram is it's intended to show the relationship between a solution and a hotspot. So on the left-hand column, you would basically describe your hotspot that you've already ranked. The green circles indicate the solution you've identified and whether it is a short, medium, or long-term solution within a roadmap. And then finally, you'll see there are some of the solutions that have an upward arrow, and that indicates that one solution may well address more than one hotspot. So again, this is a great way of pictorially visualizing how the solutions interact with the hotspots and the time frame within which they could be implemented. You can put a lot more detail around this, but as a workshopping activity, as a way of linking solutions to hotspots and going further back to value chain partners, this is quite a good way of doing it. Finally, just on the road mapping side of things, the UK's Sustainable Development Commission some time ago produced a product road mapping methodology, which is very, very intuitive, and we often use this in road mapping at a higher level than products. But it's worth looking at, and the link there to it is provided at the bottom of the slide. Okay, so having done all of this, and you're now at a point where you've identified and prioritized potential solutions. You've created a roadmap. Another way of organizing your solutions or interventions is to think of them as being kind of umbrellas. So can you cluster those solutions under strategic kind of themes or natural umbrellas? And in the project, we've called this systemic solutions. And so basically that means, is there this natural umbrella or strategic theme like beating pollution in a destination that you can use to cluster actions or interventions under, and recognizing that all of those shortlisted actions have the same overarching objective. So they could be delivered by individual tourism businesses and their value chains. They could be delivered in collaboration between tourism businesses, and that could be with or without support from government policymakers. The systemic solutions identified for each country or location or destination should look to try and encompass as many of the shortlisted solutions you have as possible and roadmap them accordingly. And finally, the systemic solutions, you should really look at them at a number of levels, from national right the way down to individual businesses. So I'll just give you an idea of what that might look like with the next slide. So here we see just a way, this is again from the Dominican Republic, our experiences there within the project. So the overarching aim there is to improve sustainability performance of the tourism value chain in the Dominican Republic. And there are some outcomes that tourism stakeholders are looking for. So they're looking to reduce resource use and greenhouse gas emissions from food production. They're looking to reduce pollution and waste in the Dominican Republic, and they're looking to reduce the consumption of fossil fuels in the tourism sector. And this for the Dominican Republic is really important because over 80% of energy generation in the Dominican Republic is from fossil fuel. Underneath that, you have a sub-outcome. So I'll just take the one on the right. So sub-outcome there to increase energy efficiency in hotels and conference venues, and to increase the use of renewable energy in the accommodation sector. So then the systemic solution, the clustering of the shortlisted ideas we had in the Dominican Republic, becomes a systemic solution around sustainable energy programs for hotels and restaurants. And then beneath that, you can see at a national level, across sectoral level, and a business level, there are a series of shortlisted actions that help to deliver that systemic solution and that overarching aim. So hopefully that makes sense. Again, it's just a really good way of organizing the thinking, and Sandra will be revisiting this structure in her discussion around policy frameworks as well. Okay. That's me finished on that. Sandra, I don't know whether we want to take questions now or we want to leave it until you've done your section.
Yeah, maybe we do that because we are running a little bit out of time. But while you pass on the presenter skills to me, I just want to clarify on one or two questions. So there was a question on how long did the Dominican project last and how many people were working on it. And also, did you had a concrete action in the Dominican project? So this is actually still ongoing, and the assessment part of the project has taken place, and we now are going through identifying with the local partners these systemic solutions. So you've seen the previous slide from Mark is actually illustrating it. So to give an example, we're looking into sustainable energy programs, we're looking into pollution in the accommodation sector, and we're looking into the food and sustainable gastronomy. So there was one clarification question that came on Dominican Republic. I'll just try to present in a very short period of time, so we still have, maybe if you all have an additional 10 minutes, we could extend the webinar for another 10 minutes to try to address a number of questions that were asked. But let me just finish with the last two sections. One is on building a business case and work plan, and the next one will be on policy framework. So to build a business case, and especially within a business entity, or so a tourism business entity, be it a hotel or a restaurant or a conference center, or a supplier of any of these venues, you would look into this business case, business model Canva, and try to say, okay, I want to bring as much sustainability as possible into my business. And so what I would like to do is suggest to my customer a value proposition. So that is the central square in the middle. So it's your idea and what you will offer that makes it sustainable, and sustainable meaning having less environmental impact, as we've seen with the hotspotting tool, as well as creating value for your business and for the society, and having also a positive impact in terms of social element, be it for the workers or for the surrounding community or the tourists. So this is really a tool, and you can get more information on this business model Canva, but it just helps picturing what you would like to do, and then what are the key customer relationship and channels, and how you will reach out to your customer. That's the green part on the right. What are the main supplies and resources that are needed, and that is the red part on the left. And then you would fill in what are the revenue streams to make sure that it makes sense business-wise and economic-wise. What are the implementation costs? And below on the right-hand side, what are the social environmental costs and benefits? So it's really a tool to be able to say, okay, sustainability actually makes business sense, and this is how I can demonstrate it to my high-level management, to the person that will be financing my ID, to the public sector with whom I'm partnering, and I want to demonstrate I can be part of the solution. This is an illustrative example. I'll just go very quickly through it. It's a joint study by RAP and the World Resources Institute, based on more than 100 restaurants across 12 countries. And what they demonstrated as a strong business financial case is that for each dollar invested in food waste prevention in restaurants, this means actually $7 of financial benefits realized. So it goes into the payback period, and here the actually benefits that you would get. We will be circulating the slides, so you will have all the information, but it's really important because on average restaurants are achieving about 26% reduction in kitchen food waste in just 1 year. And actually after 1 year, 75% of their investment was already recoupled. So there is a return on the investment that is of about 2 years, meaning afterwards you are more profitable than before, and you have reduced food waste, which has the strong environmental impact. I'll probably pass on this one for a reason of time, but again, this is really to call for action, and with different type of actions that can be used when you want to successfully reduce food waste. So measure, engage staff, rethink inventory, reduce overproduction, and repurpose excess food. this is another example of business case for energy efficiency, so that we don't talk only about food in this webinar training, with the information on efficient LED lighting, optimized heating, ventilation, and air conditioning, as well as the use of room energy management system. So I will let you discover that when receiving the slides. I think what is really important to mention is that while a business is actually developing its business case, and the policymakers are looking into creating a supportive policy framework, what is really important is the interaction between the two. And so in one case or the other, if we take the example of this project, so that we are conducting in Dominican Republic, in the Philippines, in Mauritius and St. Lucia, when Mark referred to workshops and to get and gather ideas and from different and the diverse audience, it's within these workshops that we managed to have a very large spectrum of attendees, and where you get this cross-fertilizing information, and you actually can come up with these systemic discussions that Mark described as a solution that is coming from the whole group, and so from all the stakeholders of the tourism value chain, not from the businesses on one hand, or the policymaker on the other hand, or the civil society or communities nearby on another end. So having in this workshop and in this room, the businesses, their suppliers, very important, the waste management system, the local authorities, some representative of the national authorities and governments, civil society. I won't push to say, yeah, bring the tourists as well, because maybe they want to enjoy their tourism experience, but at least staff or people that can speak on behalf of the tourists as well, is really important to get these systemic solutions right and actionable and doable. So when creating a supportive policy framework, you will see just a very quick methodology here, but the idea is to make sure that there is this room for exchange and discussion with the different stakeholders that will be impacted or will benefit from this policy framework. So this is a policy cycle which aims at framing the problem, and there are a number of tools that were showcased in the training earlier on to do that: a policy formulation action, a policy implementation, as well as monitoring and evaluation, which would lead to go back to the cycle. This information and the following one are taken from a UNEP publication funded by a European Commission related project on eco-innovation, so mainstreaming eco-innovation and in sustainable consumption and production policies, and you can access the full document. Oops, yeah. So this is just a way of checking what are the different policy type of instruments that can be used and help you identify your policy mix. And you will see that there are some regulatory instruments such as bans, for example, or some waste and landfill regulation, but also some economic instruments, be it taxes or incentives, extended producer responsibility systems, for example, research and development support as well, some information-based document, including some certification systems using eco-labels, or awareness campaign, some voluntary instruments, which would be voluntary agreement, mainly with the private sector, as well as some behavioral instruments, including campaign or nudging the tourist in that case is like, why don't you, why don't you use our water filling stations rather than buying bottles, could be an example. For each of these instruments, you just need to be careful on the pros and cons and what would help address the policy mix that is ideal in the case of your destination. So they are highlighted here, but I think I'll just advance. And we are providing here a policy checklist to make sure that there are key policy considerations and the right questions that need to be answered when finalizing the policy framework. So making sure that you've gone through all these points, and I would like to highlight two in particular that resonates particularly in the context of this training, one being adopting a life cycle thinking. So looking at whether you've covered issues and impact from a life cycle perspective, from the raw material to the production, consumption, and end of life, as well as looking into the different environmental and social impacts. And the other one is applying a value chain approach and involving the actors into the discussion and the decision, and using what motivates these actors as well, so that the solution is a win-win situation for everybody. Finally, reference to the golden thread. The idea is just to always keep in mind your overall objective, and while developing a set of solutions and a set of policy mix for a policy framework, making sure that it always helps delivering on the systemic solutions that were identified and on the outcomes that are expected, as well as the overall aim, and mainly the overall aim of the policy framework and of the whole destination, improving the sustainability performance of tourism value chain. So this is to present in a nutshell the tools that are available for business and for policy framework making, and emphasize the importance of why do we talk about this in the context of a value chain training and a tourism value chain training, is because all the actors that we have discussed about, and all the direct and indirect actors, identifying the hotspots are important and should be involved while identifying the hotspots, while looking into what are the type of solutions that we can have, and looking, okay, when we have this solution or overall systemic solution, we have different levels and different type of instruments that, well orchestrated and well organized, can actually help us meet our objective of sustainability. So with that, I am finalizing the presentation section, and would like to thank you very much for your time and for your attendance. If you're okay, we can have probably a maximum of 5 minutes to answer some questions. So I think I'll just maybe hand over the presentation. Mark, can I make you presenter again?
Sure.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. In terms of question, we had one on whether the project is covering business events or conference center. So the answer is yes. It's more about the fact that we have used Dominican Republic as an example where in Dominican Republic we didn't implement specifically the conference event, but the same tools can be used looking into the focusing into the conference center and what are the inputs and what are the impact of all activities related to conference center and business events. There was also a question on an organization saying, I have challenges because my organization is operating in 7 African countries and the value chain is incredibly complex. So where would be the best place to start from a head office perspective? Should we focus on high impact and frequently use items first? So maybe if you want to address that one, Mark.
Sure. So yeah, that would absolutely be the right way of doing it. So if you're looking at your procurement activity and patterns across 7 countries in Africa, it's just trying to understand the volume of product or the delivery of service in each of those destinations, and get a sense of how to prioritize, maybe not try and do it all at once. So maybe work first with your largest operation, and then look at where the, if you like, the economic and the materials hotspots are. So how much are you spending on what material in that initial destination? And intuitively, just from what you've heard today, think about where those hotspots might be in terms of products, services, infrastructure, and so on, taking that whole product lifecycle view of things as well. So don't, move beyond the immediate tier 1 suppliers and think about that too. But definitely a starting point is the tier 1 suppliers in that largest destination that you have, and then look at what your procurement patterns are in terms of products and services, and go for the big numbers first, in the hope that in a lot of cases there is a vague proxy between units and economic value and environmental impact. It's a place to start anyway.
Thank you. And another broad question that we had, which is what a great tool, is it possible to also analyze the social and human rights impacts with the hotspot analysis tool that you are presenting?
Wow.
So I think there is a room to actually make sure that the social and human rights elements are present, where you had the green and
Yeah.
the red circles.
Yeah.
But and I also know that there is actually a social life cycle tool that exists. But yeah, feel free to elaborate.
Yeah, so there is, so you're right, the Lifecycle initiative at UN Environment does provide best practice guidance on social impact assessment. There are obviously also regulatory frameworks around some of these social and ethical issues. Just to give a few examples, living wage requirements, modern slavery acts and bills, all of those sorts of things as well. And yeah, kind of fair wage, fair trade practices. We haven't really done that much within the tool on it, but there are other tools. I'm just thinking there is also a social impacts tool that relates to products that's been produced by an organization called PRE, and they have formed a round table to look at the kind of the metrics and the processes around social impact assessment as well. So that's in addition to the Lifecycle Initiative's guidance. But I think a lot of this will get picked up when you look at the regulatory environment. When you're looking at the value chain, you're having conversations with the policymakers. That sort of issue will become much clearer, I think, and the level of priority that needs to be applied to it will be a bit more evident if you talk to the relevant ministries and agencies. Or you might actually have an overarching corporate policy on something like that, which you've absolutely got to comply with.
Thank you very much, Mark. And well, I think we did mention we have about 5 minutes left, and they're probably gone at this moment. Thank you all very much for your attendance. As we offered, we will be looking into questions that haven't been answered, but I think we answered a good number of them already, and provide any feedback on these ones. And just to mention that the webinar tomorrow will actually be on the same topic, so it will be it has been scheduled in the afternoon for different time zone to be able to attend. So you're of course welcome to come back, but you will hear likely the same information apart from the questions, obviously. So thank you very much for your attendance and for your time, for your more than 25 questions actually. And I would like to thank also Mark for his presentation and being very clear, as well as my colleagues Svetlana and Maëlys for the work behind the scene.
Thank you, everyone.